Welcome back to Nicki Woo Cozy Stories. I'm your host, Nicki. Tonight, we return to the garden for the moment everything is seen. Our cozy retelling of The Secret Garden comes to its close, episode 13, When His Father Sees Him. Let's begin. The garden had come into its full season, and with it, there had settled a quiet understanding among all living things within its walls. It was not something spoken, nor even something that could easily be seen, but it moved gently through the air, as though every leaf and branch and small beating heart had come to know the same truth in its own way. Each morning revealed something new, though nothing arrived suddenly. The changes unfolded as if they had always been waiting. Buds opened without announcement. Petals loosened themselves into the light, and the grass beneath grew deep and soft, holding the warmth of sun as though it remembered it long after the day had shifted. High among those close-grown branches, the robin's nest lay hidden in a place chosen with great care. Within it were eggs, small and pale, resting in a stillness that held more than silence. The robin's mate sat upon them, her body slightly curved protectively, her wings drawn close, her breast rising and falling with a steady, watchful rhythm. At first, she hadn't trusted the garden, though it was filled with growing things. Though the air itself seemed gentle, she had felt the need to guard against all that might come near. The robin had shared this vigilance, keeping close, his bright eyes sharp, his small body alert to every movement among the leaves. Even the children had been counted among the uncertain things. Dickon had known this without being told. He had kept his distance from the hidden corner where the branches thickened, moving instead through the open spaces with a quiet patience that belonged to him as naturally as breathing. There was something in the way he waited, in the absence of any wish or to take or to disturb, that seemed to carry meaning. It was as though he had spoken, though no word had passed, of safety. Little by little, the feeling spread. It moved through the garden as softly as the wind through the leaves, touching one thing and then another, until it settled even upon the robin's mate as she kept her place upon the nest. Her watchfulness remained, but it no longer trembled with unease. It became something steadier, something that did not question every sound. For there had grown, among them all, a kind of shared knowing. If there had been even one creature in that garden who didn't understand, deeply and entirely, that the eggs must be kept safe, that no harm must come near them, then the quiet happiness of those days could not have existed. It was felt without being spoken, as though the air itself would have changed had that understanding been broken. The robin knew it. His mate knew that he knew it. And in some quiet way, all the others knew it too. Mary and Colin came each day, moving along the paths as though they had always belonged there. At first, they had been watched with careful attention, their presence measured against the safety of the place. But there was nothing in them that jarred against the stillness. Their voices didn't rise sharply, their steps didn't startle the small creatures, and they carried with them no sense of interruption. Mary's eyes were often turned toward the small and growing things, as though she had learned to see what had once been hidden from her. Colin moved more slowly, but with a steadiness that had begun to take root within him. The garden seemed to receive him, not as something separate, but as something that had found its proper place. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they did not. The silence between them rested easily, filled with the soft stirring of leaves, the distant call of birds, and the faint movements of life unfolding in unseen corners. And above them, within the sheltering branches, the robin remained near. He no longer kept to the deepest cover, nor did he watch with the sharpness he once had. He perched where he could see, his small body at ease, his bright eye attentive, but untroubled. The garden had told him what he needed to know. Nothing here would harm the eggs. And so, the days passed in that quiet, golden way, each one adding gently to the next, until it seemed that the garden itself was holding something precious, not only within the nest, but within every living thing that had come to belong there. As the days passed, the sense of watchfulness, which had once belonged so strongly to the robin and his mate, faded into something gentler, until it seemed scarcely to trouble them at all. The garden had settled into a rhythm that held no sharp edges, and the small lives within it moved easily, as though guided by an understanding that required no thought. The boy who could speak robin had continued to do the curious things he did with the others, standing, stretching, moving his limbs in a way that at first seemed strange and uncertain. Yet there had been no suddenness in it, no quick darting movement such as might belong to danger. The robin had come to accept these actions as belonging to a harmless kind of living. There were moments when Colin would move with a kind of earnest concentration, lifting his arms, setting his feet, as though he were learning something that did not yet come easily. To the robin, whose own strength had never needed to be learned in such a way, it had seemed at first a puzzling thing. But there was no alarm in it now. It became simply another part of curious behavior of human creatures, no more threatening than the rustling of leaves or the shifting of light across the ground. And as the boy grew stronger, the last small uneasiness slipped quietly away. He walked more steadily now, and sometimes even ran a little, his movements no longer halting or uncertain. He worked beside the others, turning the earth, pulling small weeds from the soil, and moving about the garden with growing ease. There was no longer anything in him that suggested he might fall or fail. The garden seemed to have taken him into its keeping, as it had taken everything else. The nest in the hidden corner was no longer overshadowed by a faint anxiety. It rested in a peace so complete that it seemed almost to deepen in stillness around it. The robin's mate no longer lifted herself at every distant sound, nor did the robin keep such constant guard. Their attention turned outward more often, drawn by the many small and changing things that filled the days. For there was much to observe. From her place upon the nest, the robin's mate could see the children as they moved through the garden, their presence no longer a disturbance, a source of quiet interest. They were unlike anything else that lived within the walls, and yet they had become a part of the same gentle order. Their voices rose and fell in soft tones. Their movements carried no threat, and there was something in their nearness that seemed to bring a kind of companionship to the hours. On days when the sky remained clear and the sun rested warmly upon the ground, there was always something to watch. The children worked, rested, spoke together, and moved among the growing things with a sense of belonging that deepened each day. But when the rain came, and the garden lay under a soft and steady falling of water, their absence was felt. The robin's mate didn't leave her nest, but she became aware of the change in a way that she had not expected. The rain softened all sound, drawing a veil across the garden so that even the smallest stirrings seemed distant. The leaves bent beneath the weight of the water, and the pathways darkened, holding the quiet of the sky above them. There were no familiar footsteps then, no low voices passing between the trees, no gentle disturbances of air that marked the children's presence. The garden remained full and living, yet something within its rhythm seemed to pause, as though it too had grown accustomed to their coming and found their absence noticeable in a small, unspoken way. The robin's mate, keeping her place upon the eggs, found her attention turning outward more on these such days. She watched the falling rain, the slow movement of branches, the shifting of light behind the clouds. It wasn't unease she felt, nor any return of fear, but a quieter kind of waiting, an awareness that something which had become part of the day was for a time withheld. Still, even in that softened stillness, the sense of safety remained unchanged. The eggs were as secure as though they had been hidden far from all things, held in a place beyond reach. There was no longer any fear that harm might come near them. And within the house, though the garden couldn't see it, the same quiet change was continuing. One morning, when the rain fell without ceasing and the light beyond the windows lay soft and gray, Colin found himself restless in a way he had not known before. The stillness that had once held him so easily now seemed to press upon him. He lay upon the sofa, aware of the strength in his limbs, aware of the growing life within him that no longer wished to be quiet. "My legs and arms," he said after a time, his voice filled with a kind of wondering impatience. "They feel as if they must be doing something always. When I wake in the morning, it's as if everything is already awake before I am. Even the trees seem to be calling out." Mary, seated near him, watched him with a brightness in her eyes that answered his own feeling. "They would think you had gone quite mad," she said, her tone light with amusement, "if you were to begin shouting with them." He smiled at that, the thought settling easily into his mind. It no longer troubled him to imagine how others might see him. Instead, there was something almost pleasant in it, as though he had come to belong to a different understanding altogether. "I should like to tell my father," he said, after a moment, more quietly now. "I think of it often, but I cannot go on pretending as I have done. I am not the same." The rain continued against the windows, steady and unbroken. Mary was silent for a while, her thoughts moving in her own direction. Then, with a sudden lift of her head, she spoke again, her voice holding a quiet spark. "Do you know," she said, "how many rooms there are in this house?" Colin turned toward her, surprised, the question carrying with it the beginning of something new. The rain hadn't lifted, but something in the morning had shifted all the same. Mary's question lingered between them, quiet at first, as though it had been placed there without urgency. Colin looked at her with a kind of thoughtful curiosity, his restlessness turning toward it, as though it offered direction. "How many rooms?" he repeated. "Yes," Mary said, "there are a great many, and a great number no one ever goes into." She spoke without exaggeration, but there was a steadiness in her tone that gave her words weight. It was not simply the number of rooms that mattered, but the way that she had seen them, alone, unnoticed, belonging to no one in particular. "One day," she continued, "when it rained like this, I went wandering. I didn't know where I was going. I only kept opening doors." Colin listened closely now. "I found corridors that seemed to lead nowhere," she said, "and rooms that had been shut so long that the air inside them felt still and old. There were chairs no one had sat in for years, and cabinets filled with curious things. I saw a little room with ivory elephants, and another where the walls were covered in brocade, and there was a place where a mouse had made a hole in a cushion." She paused slightly, remembering. "I went farther than I meant to," she added, "and when I tried to come back, I lost my way." Colin leaned forward a little, the idea taking hold of him. "It sounds like the garden," he said. "Only inside." Mary gave a small nod. "Yes, it does." There was a small moment when neither of them spoke, but the thought had already begun to move between them, growing quietly. "We might go," Colin said after a moment. Mary's eyes lifted to this at once. "We might," she answered. The rain continued steadily against the windows, but it no longer held them as it had before. The day seemed suddenly larger, as though the house itself had opened in some unseen way. "If I had my chair," Colin said slowly, "I could be taken as far as the gallery. After that—" He didn't finish, but the meaning rested clearly between them. Mary understood. "No one would follow us," she said. "There are places where no one ever comes." Colin's expression settled into something firm and quiet. "Ring the bell," he said. When the nurse came, he gave his orders with a calm assurance that left little room for question. He spoke simply, as though the matter had already been decided, and there was something in his manner which made it easier for her to obey than hesitate. They were taken as far as the long gallery and left there as he had directed. The sound of retreating footsteps faded, and with it went the last small sense of being watched or guided. For a moment, neither of them moved. The quiet of the place was different from that of the garden, but it held no discomfort. It seemed, instead, to wait. Colin rose from the chair. There was no pause of doubt now, no inward hesitation. He stood with steadiness that belonged to him fully, as though the strength that he had gathered had last become something he trusted without question. "I'm going to run from one end of the gallery to the other," he said, "and then I shall jump, and then we shall do the exercises." Mary watched him without speaking. He began at once. His first steps were measured, but he didn't falter. The long stretch of floor opened before him, and he crossed it with growing ease, his movement finding its own rhythm. When he reached the far end, he turned and came back again, more lightly this time, as though the effort had already begun to feel natural to him. They went on to the exercises Dickon had shown him. Colin lifted his arms, stretched them outward, bent and straightened, each motion carried out with care, but without uncertainty. The space allowed him to move freely, and there was something in that freedom which seemed to deepen his confidence. When at last they stopped, it was not from weariness, but because the moment had reached its fullness. "I like it," he said quietly. "I like the house." Mary smiled. "So do I." They wandered then, as Mary had once done alone, but now together. Doors were opened, and rooms revealed themselves in quiet succession. There were places filled with objects whose use was no longer remembered, and others where the light fell in such a way that everything seemed newly seen. They found the small Indian room, where the ivory elephant stood arranged behind glass, pale and finely shaped. Mary paused there, her memory returning to her first wandering. "It's different now," she said softly. Colin looked at the figures, then back at her. "It is all different now," he answered. They moved on, discovering corridors and corners, turning into places that seemed both part of the house and apart from it. There was a curious feeling in wandering there, of being within familiar walls and yet far from ordinary life. At last they returned. When the tray was brought, they ate with an appetite that surprised even themselves, the simple meal carrying a quiet satisfaction that had once been unknown. Downstairs, the tray was set down with a firmness that drew attention, and voices rose in low conversation. There was a curiosity in them, and a kind of wonder, not yet fully spoken. "This is a house of mysteries," one voice said, "and those two children are the greatest mysteries in it." Another answered with a note of rough humor, speaking of strength gained and weight increased, of changes that could no longer be overlooked. The house, which had long kept its silence, seemed to stir faintly with these observations. Later, when the afternoon had settled, Mary sat quietly in Colin's room. Her eyes were drawn to the picture above the mantel. The curtain had been drawn back. She noticed it before, but now she looked at it steadily, saying nothing. Colin, who had been watching her, spoke after a moment. "I know what you're thinking," he said. "You are wondering why I have left it so." Mary turned to him. "Yes." He was quiet for a little while before answering. "It doesn't make me angry now," he said at last. The words settled gently in the room. "One night," he continued, "when the moon was bright, I woke and I felt as if everything was full of something I couldn't name. I couldn't lie still. I went to the window, and the light seemed to be everywhere. I fell upon the curtain, and I went to it without thinking." Mary listened without moving. "I drew it back, and I looked at her." He paused, but there was no hesitation in him. "She didn't seem as she once did. It was as though she were looking down, and glad." The room remained very still. "I like to see her now. I want her to be there." Mary's gaze returned to the picture. "You are like her," she said thoughtfully. "Sometimes I think you are almost the same." Colin considered this. "If I were," he said slowly, "my father would care for me." Mary turned toward him again. "Do you wish him to?" she asked. There was no quick answer. "I used not to," he said, "but I think I do now. If he could be made to see, if he could know, perhaps he would feel as I do." He was quiet for a moment longer. "I should like to tell him about the magic," he added softly. Their belief in the magic had settled into something steady and unquestioned, as natural to them now as the rhythm of the mornings themselves. It was no longer something they spoke of only with excitement or wonder, but something lived, something that moved quietly beneath all they did. After their morning exercises, when the garden lay still in that gentle hour before the day fully warmed, Colin sometimes chose to speak. He did so with a seriousness that held its own kind of quiet amusement, as though he were both entirely in earnest and faintly aware of the role that he had given himself. "I like to lecture," he explained one morning, resting lightly against the tree as though it were a place that belonged to him, "because when I grow up and make scientific discoveries, I shall have to tell people about them. This is practice. I cannot make very long lectures yet, because I am still young, but I shall improve." Mary, who sat upon the grass with her hands loosely folded, listened without interruption, her eyes steady and thoughtful. Dickon, crouched nearby with a small cluster of weeds in his hand, glanced up now and again, his expression bright and with quiet understanding. Ben Weatherstaff, who had stationed himself not far away, gave a short sound that might have been agreement or amusement. "The best of lecturing," he said, leaning upon his spade, "is that a man can say what he likes, and no one need answer him back. I've a mind to try myself some day." Colin smiled slightly at this, though he didn't allow it to interrupt the gravity of his purpose. But while he spoke, Ben did not truly attend to the words. His gaze, sharp and searching beneath this habitual roughness, remained fixed upon the boy himself. There was something in the way he looked, something measuring, and yet not unkind. He had seen changes, not all at once, nor in any way that could easily be named, but steadily, day by day. The thinness that had seemed fixed had softened, the uncertain movements that had grown sure, the head, which had once bent as though under a weight, now lifted and remained so without effort. And there was something else, something in his eyes, a light he had seen before. He didn't speak of it. Colin, however, felt the weight of that gaze, and once, when the morning had fallen into a softer quiet and his words had ceased, he had turned suddenly. "What are you thinking about, Ben Weatherstaff?" he asked. Ben shifted slightly, as though brought back from a place he had not meant to show. "I was thinking," he answered, after a moment, "as thou gained a fair bit this week. There's more o' thee than there was. I'd not mind seeing thee on a pair of scales." Colin's expression changed then, not into laughter, but into something brighter, more assured. "It is magic," he said, "and Mrs. Sowerby's buns, and the milk, and the air, and everything. The experiment has succeeded." There was no boasting in it, only a calm certainty. The morning passed easily into work, as it always did. The rain of the days before had left the earth softened and generous, and with it had come the quick rising of weeds among the flowers. There was much to be done, and they set to it without complaint. Dickon worked as he always did, quietly, steadily, with a kind of ease that seemed to belong as much to the creatures about him as to himself. Mary moved beside him, her hands sure and careful, her attention given wholly to what lay before her. And Colin worked. There had been a time when even the thought would have seemed impossible, but now he bent, reached, pulled, and rose again without hesitation. His movements were not hurried, but they were sure, and there was a growing strength in them which did not falter. As he worked, he spoke now and then, continuing his lecture in fragments, as though the thoughts came to him as naturally as movements of his hands. "The magic works best when you work yourself," he said. "You can feel it in your muscles, in your bones. I'm going to read books about muscles, but I shall write a book about magic, because no one else understands it properly." No one answered him, but neither did they dismiss what he said. The words were allowed to settle where they would, as naturally as everything else in the garden. For a little while, there was only the quiet work, the soft sound of earth, the faint movement of leaves, the distant call of something unseen. Then, without warning, Colin stopped. The trowel slipped from his hand and fell lightly to the ground. He remained still for a moment, as though something within him had called him to attention. Mary looked up at once. Dickon did the same. Colin straightened slowly, then all at once lifted himself fully upright, as though he had been drawn upward by something he did not resist. His shoulders came back, his head rose, and his arms moved outward with a sudden, unguarded exultation. Color rose in his face. His eyes widened, not with surprise, but with recognition. "Mary! Dickon!" he cried. "Look at me!" They rose without thinking, drawn by the change in him. "Do you remember," he said quickly, his voice carrying a new intensity, "that first morning you brought me here?" "Aye," said Dickon quietly. Mary said nothing, but her gaze did not leave Colin's face. "Just now," he went on, "I remembered it myself. When I was digging, I had to stand up to see if it was true, and it is true." He drew a breath, as though it filled him completely. "I am well," he said. "I am well." The words came again, stronger. "I am well." It was not a declaration made for others. It was something realized, something known. He had believed it before. He had hoped it. He had spoken it as a part of the magic they all held. But now it was something that moved through him entirely. "I shall live forever and ever and ever," he cried, not in wildness, but in a kind of overflowing certainty. "I shall find out everything. I shall never stop making magic." Ben Weatherstaff, who had been working near the rosebush, turned his head and regarded him with a steady eye. "Thou might sing the doxology," he said dryly. Colin turned to him at once. What is that?" "Dickon can sing it," Ben replied. Dickon smiled, his expression easy and untroubled. "They sing it in church," he said. "Mother says the skylarks sing it too, when they rise in the mornin'." "If she says so, it must be a good song," Colin answered. "Sing it, Dickon. I should like to hear it." Dickon didn't hesitate. The sunlight lay warm upon them, and the scent of the earth and the green growing things rose gently in the still air. The work had slowed without any one of them quite deciding it should. It was as though something had drawn their attention inward and upward at once. Dickon stood among the rose bushes, his cap pushed back, his face lifted a little, as if he was listening to something beyond the sound of their own voices. Then simply, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, he began to sing. "Praise God from all whose blessings flow. Praise him, all creatures here below. Praise him above, ye heavenly host. Praise Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen." His voice was clear and strong, but unforced, carrying easily through the garden. It didn't seem to rise above the place, but to belong to it, as though the trees and the soft wind among the leaves understood it and held it. For a moment, the others didn't join him. Then Colin's voice came, less certain at first, but bright and earnest, and Mary's followed, steady and careful, and before the second line was finished, they were all singing together. Ben Weatherstaff stood stiffly where he had been, his hands half curled at his sides. He cleared his throat once, sharply, as though the sound annoyed him. But when the third line came, he joined in, his rough voice catching and then deepening into something full and unexpected. The sound filled the garden. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It moved outward and settled over the grass and the branches and the open sky beyond the walls, as though it were a part of the quiet life which had been growing there day by day. When they came to the last word, Amen, the sound lingered. No one spoke. The air seemed to hold the echo of it, not a noise, but as a feeling that remained after the voice it had fallen silent. Even the small movements of the leaves seemed to quiet themselves, as though unwilling to break what had been made. Ben Weatherstaff turned his face aside and rubbed it roughly with the back of his hand, muttering something under his breath. Dickon stood easy and still, his eyes bright. Mary didn't move at all. Colin stood with his head lifted. There was a look in his face which had not been there before. Not only joy, but something steadier. Something that had settled deeper than the quick brightness of his excitement. He seemed to be listening, not to the song, which had ended, but to something which followed it. The garden lay open and sunlit around them, and yet, all at once his expression changed. Not with fear, not even with surprise, but with a kind of alert wonder, as though something just beyond sight had made itself known. He turned his head slightly toward the ivied wall. "Who's coming in here?" he said quickly. "Who is it?" The door in the ivied wall had been pushed gently open. No one had heard it. It had not creaked or caught. It had only moved, slowly, quietly, until the space beyond it was no longer closed. In the opening stood a woman. She didn't step forward at once. She remained where she was for a moment, her hands still resting lightly against the wood, her eyes moving over the garden as though she were taking in something she had long expected, and had now, at last, come to see. Dickon turned first. The moment his eyes fell upon her, something bright and immediate lit his face. Recognition without surprise, as though he had expected her all along. "It's mother," he said, and he went to her at once. There was no hesitation in it. He crossed the space quickly, as naturally as breath, and came to stand close beside her, his presence settling easily into hers. He didn't speak again, nor did he need to. There was a quiet understanding between them, which required nothing more. Mary rose slowly to her feet. Colin didn't move at once. He stood very still, looking toward the doorway, and something in his face changed, not into uncertainty, but into a kind of deep attention, as though he were seeing something that mattered to him in a way that he had not known before. Mrs. Sowerby stepped into the garden then. She closed the door gently behind her, not turning her back on them as she did, but keeping her gaze upon the 3 children. There was no hurry in her movements, and no self-consciousness. She walked forward across the grass as though she had always had the right to enter there. The sunlight fell softly across her face. She looked first at Dickon, and something warm and familiar passed between them. Then her eyes moved to Mary, and there was a quiet recognition there too. At last, she looked at Colin. She didn't speak. She stood still and looked at him fully, taking him in, not only as he was in that moment, but as though she saw something that had been growing unseen and had not come into the light. Colin took a step toward her. It was not hurried. It was uncertain. He went as though drawn, not by curiosity, but by something steadier. When he stood before her, he didn't bow, and he didn't hold himself back as he might once have done. He looked up at her face directly. "Even when I was ill," he said, "I wanted to see you." His voice was quiet, but clear. "You and Dickon and the garden, I never wanted anything else before." He had not planned to say it. The words came as though they had been waiting. Mrs. Sowerby drew in a breath. For a moment, she didn't answer. There was something in her expression which softened and deepened at once, and her eyes shone, not with surprise, but with a feeling that had been stirred. "Oh, dear lad," she said at last. Her voice was full. "Oh, dear lad." She stepped nearer and took his hand. Her hands were warm and firm, shaped by work and use, but gentle in their hold. She didn't take his hand as though he were fragile, nor as though he were distant. She took it simply, as though she had known him always. And Colin did not draw away. Something in him, something that had been restless, searching, uncertain even in his strength, grew quiet under her touch. "Are you surprised?" he asked her. "Because I'm so well?" He asked it with a kind of open curiosity, not seeking praise, but wanting to know. Mrs. Sowerby looked at him carefully. Her gaze moved over him, not quickly, not searching for faults, but steadily, taking in what was there, the straightness of his back, the strength in his stance, the light in his eyes. "No," she said. She spoke simply. "No, I am not surprised." Then, after a moment, "I knew it would come." Colin drew in a deeper breath. "You knew?" he said. "Aye," she answered. "When a lad sets his mind to growing, and fills it with good thoughts instead of bad, there's naught can hinder him long, not if he's given half a chance." Her eyes moved, just briefly, to Mary. "And he's had his chance," she added quietly. Mary felt the words without looking up. Dickon stood easy beside his mother, his presence quiet and sure. Behind them, Ben Weatherstaff made a sound in his throat and turned his face aside, as though he had no concern for such talk, but he didn't move away. Colin's hand remained in Miss Sowerby's. "I am going to live forever," he said. He spoke it now, without the earlier burst of exultation. It came more quietly, but with greater certainty. "And I am going to make magic." Mrs. Sowerby's mouth curved slightly, not in amusement, but in agreement. "Aye," she said, "thou already has." The garden held them then. The sunlight rested across the grass. The leaves stirred softly overhead. The air moved gently through the space between them. Nothing needed to be said. And yet everything that had been growing, quietly, steadily, had come into its own. There was a kind of quiet happiness in the garden after that. It didn't come all at once, nor with a great display, but settled among them gently, like warmth after a long chill, or sunlight spreading slowly across the ground. Mrs. Sowerby remained with them beneath the tree while they ate. She didn't hurry them, nor speak too much, but watched with a soft, satisfied look as they finished what she had brought. Every now and then she laughed, not loudly, but with a warm, low sound that seemed to belong to the place as much as the birdsong did. It was a comfortable sort of laughter, the kind that made things feel steady and right. Colin had never known such a meal. It was not only the food itself, though that was hearty and simple and good, but something in the way it was shared, and the way no one watched him anxiously, nor measured what he ate, nor spoke of strength as something fragile. He ate because he was hungry, and when he finished, he leaned back slightly, drawing in a long breath, as though he had only just realized how deeply content he was. Mrs. Sowerby noticed it at once. "There now," she said softly, "that's learning." Colin turned to her. "Learning what?" he asked. "How to live," she answered. She simply said it, as though it needed no explanation. For a moment, no one spoke. The garden seemed to listen. Mary sat very still, her hands folded loosely in her lap, her eyes moving from Colin to Mrs. Sowerby and back again. There was something in her face that had changed, not suddenly, but in a way that had been coming for some time. She didn't feel alone. That was the difference. Not in the garden, not now. Dickon lay stretched on the grass nearby, one arm behind his head, looking up through the branches. A small creature, one of his constant companions, had settled close to him, as though it too understood that this was a moment not to be disturbed. Even Ben Weatherstaff had ceased his muttering. He stood a little apart, his hands resting on the handle of his spade, his sharp eyes watching them all beneath his heavy brows. From time to time, he made a rough sound in his throat, but he didn't interrupt. The easy, comfortable feeling didn't pass when the meal was done. It lingered. No one seemed in any haste to move or to break the quiet happiness that had settled among them. The basket lay open beside them, the last crumbs forgotten, and the sunlight shifted slowly through the leaves above their heads. Mrs. Sowerby didn't rise. She remained where she was, as if she belonged there, just as much as the tree, or the grass, or the soft moving air itself. Now and then she spoke, telling them small things, simple things, in her broad Yorkshire way, bits of stories, bits of sense, bits of laughter that came and went as easily as breath. Mary listened without interrupting. Colin listened too, but in a different way. There were moments when he leaned forward slightly, as if something she said had touched a thought already waiting inside of him. And there were moments when he sat very still, his eyes resting on her face, as though he were trying to understand something not spoken at all. Dickon lay stretched upon the grass, content and watchful, his creatures quiet near him. And even Ben Weatherstaff, working a little distance off, had fallen to a kind of listening silence, though he would not have said so if asked. It was as if the garden itself had drawn a little closer around them. The sounds beyond the walls seemed farther away. The world outside didn't press in. Nothing hurried, nothing disturbed. And in that stillness, held gently between talk and quiet, between laughter and thought, there was the feeling that something more had not yet been said. Something that was waiting. The quiet didn't break all at once. It shifted. Mrs. Sowerby, who had been speaking in her easy, steady way, paused as though something in the air had drawn her attention inward. She looked from one to another of them, and then back again, her expression thoughtful, but warm. "Well," she said at last, "there's a many a thing as sets a folk thinking, and most on it's no more nor what's been there all along." Colin leaned forward a little. "What do you mean?" he asked. Miss Sowerby's eyes rested on him. "I mean," she said, "as there a big good thing in this world, whether we call it by one name or another, and it's in the garden same as it's in us, if we give it room." She spoke without weight, without trying to persuade. The words seemed to settle where they would, as naturally as the light through the leaves. Dickon nodded, as though this were nothing new to him. "Aye," he said softly, "it's working and everything." Colin drew a breath. "It's the magic," he said. Mrs. Sowerby gave a small smile. "Aye," she answered, "thou may call it that." There was a little pause after that, but it wasn't empty. It felt full. Mary shifted slightly on the grass, her eyes thoughtful. "It's what makes things grow," she said, "and makes people grow." Mrs. Sowerby looked at her with quiet approval. "That's a fair way of saying it," she replied. For a few moments they spoke together, simply, easily, each saying what came to them, not as though they were explaining something, but as though they were discovering it in the saying. Then, as naturally as the thought had come, Mrs. Sowerby spoke again. "Thou'll have thy father home one of these days," she said. The words did not fall heavy. They came as though they belonged. Colin looked at her at once. "My father," he said. "Aye," she answered. "He'll come when the time's right. A man cannot stay away forever when there's summat calling him back." Colin was still. The thought didn't startle him. It settled slowly, as other thoughts had begun to settle. "I should like to see him," he said. There was no bitterness in it, only a quiet truth. Miss Sowerby nodded. "Aye," she said, "and he'll like to see thee." There was a small silence after that. Something in Colin's face changed, not outwardly, but inwardly, as though a space long held closed had opened a little further. He looked at her, and then, quite simply, "I wish you were my mother." She moved at once. My dear lad," she cried. She caught him to her, holding him close as if he had been her own. "Thou art as much my lad as Dickon is," she said, "and I'm that fond on thee." She didn't let him go. "But thou's got thy own mother," she went on, "and she's not lost to thee." Colin lifted his head a little. "Not lost?" he said. Mrs. Sowerby shook her head. "No," she answered. "She's in this garden, here." The words were not spoken as something to be believed or questioned. They were just said as something known. "In the flowers," she added softly, "and in the trees, and in the growing of growing things, and in thee too, same as she always was." The garden lay still about them. No one spoke. The leaves stirred faintly overhead, and the sunlight shifted upon the ground, and something in the quiet seemed to deepen, not into silence, but into presence. Colin didn't look away. He stood very still, his breath slow and even. His face changed, not with surprise, but with a kind of recognition that came from somewhere deeper than thought. "And thy father," Mrs. Sowerby said after a moment, "he'll come back to thee." Colin turned his head slightly. "Aye," she went on, "he mun come. There's too much calling him." She didn't say more. She didn't need to. The words remained, and after a little while, she loosened her arm from about him. "Well now," she said gently, as though returning to themselves without breaking what had been given. Keep to it. They understood her. Mary nodded. Dickon smiled. Colin drew a quiet breath. I shall, he said. And in the garden, where everything had been growing unseen and steadily, the promise seemed already to have taken root. There are, in the turning of years, certain quiet discoveries which seem at first too simple to be of consequence, and yet, once they are known, they cannot be set aside. They don't arrive with noise or demand, but with a kind of steady presence, as though they had always existed and had only waited to be seen. It had come to be understood, though not by any formal naming, that thoughts themselves carried a weight. They moved unseen, and yet they shaped what they touched, much as sunlight or shadow might alter the growth of a thing rooted in the earth. A thought allowed to remain could settle deeply, and only gently chosen might take the place of another, without struggle. Mary had not learned this in a single moment. It had come to her slowly, carried in the small changes of her days, the growing things in the garden, the steady companionship of Dickon, the quiet unfolding of Colin's strength. Without intending it, her mind had filled itself with other things, and the sharper, more restless thoughts that had found less room to remain. Where once she had watched the world with a kind of guarded indifference, she now found herself noticing what lay before her with steadier attention. The air, the movement of leaves, the sounds that came and went without effort, all these had taken her place within her, until they seemed to belong there as naturally as her own breath. Colin's change had followed its own path, though it had been shaped by the same quiet influence. For a long while, his thoughts had turned always upon himself, upon weakness, upon fear, upon the constant expectation that something within him would fail. These thoughts had not been questioned. They had been allowed to remain, and in remaining, they had taken on a kind of authority. But when other thoughts had begun to press gently against them, there had been a shift. It had not come through force, nor through argument, but through presence. The garden, the air, the movement of its own body, the steady certainty of those around him, these had begun to fill the space where fear had once settled. It was as though something had been cleared without disturbance. Strength came, not as something newly given, but as something uncovered. It moved through him with a steadiness that did not call attention to itself, and yet could not be mistaken. His limbs responded without hesitation. His breath came easily, and there was within him a growing awareness that he was no longer held by the limits he had once believed were fixed. There is a simple truth, though it is not always easily remembered, that where one thing takes root and is tended, another cannot remain. The garden, in its quiet way, had always known this. Where the rose was cared for, the thistle did not thrive. Where light reached and remained, the shadow could not deepen beyond its place. It was not a matter of struggle, but of presence. And so it had been with the children. While the garden came gradually into its fullness, they had come into their own in much the same manner. There had been no sudden change, no single moment that marked the turning. Instead, there had been a steady continuation, each day building upon the last, until what had once seemed unlikely no longer required explanation. Beyond the walls of Misselthwaite, however, there was another life moving on its own course, untouched for a time by these quiet changes. Far from the moor, beyond the familiar reach of the English countryside, a man wandered through places of great beauty, and yet carried little of that beauty within him. He had traveled long, passing from one country to another, seeking neither company nor rest. The valleys and mountains through which he moved held a stillness of their own, vast and unbroken, filled with clear air and distant light. There were lakes that reflected the sky without disturbance, and slopes where flowers grew in quiet abundance. Yet, these things did not remain with him. He saw them, but they did not settle. For many years his thoughts had been of a different kind. They had turned inward, and in turning had drawn about him a kind of heaviness that did not easily lift. Even in the presence of beauty, there had been no space within him for it to remain. He had not sought to change this. It had become familiar to him, and what is familiar often goes unchallenged. He walked alone, often choosing the quietest paths, as though the absence of others might bring some form of ease. Yet the solitude did not lighten him. It remained as steady as his step, as constant as the passing of the days. His name, when it was spoken or written, was Archibald Craven. There were those who saw him in passing and wondered at the look that he carried, for there was something in it that suggested both weariness and distance, as though he moved through the world without fully belonging to it. He didn't linger where he was, nor did he return to places he had already seen. Time moved around him without alteration. And yet, though he didn't know it, there are moments which approach without announcement, and when they arrive, they carry with them the beginning of something not yet understood. One such moment came to him in a quiet valley, where a small stream ran clear over stones, its movement light and continuous. The sound it made was not loud, but it was filled with the stillness in a way that did not disturb it. It seemed to belong there, as naturally as the air itself. He had walked a long distance that day, and when he came upon the stream, he stopped. There was no reason for it beyond a simple weariness, and so he lowered himself to the ground, where the moss grew soft and thick beside the water. For a time, he did nothing but remain there. The valley held its stillness, the stream moved on, untroubled. Somewhere nearby, birds came and went, their movements brief and unforced. He watched without intention, and slowly, without his seeking it, something within him began to quiet. It didn't happen all at once. It came in small degrees, as though a tension long held was loosening of its own accord. The sound of the water continued, steady and low, and he found himself listening to it, though he had not meant to. His gaze rested upon the edge of the stream, where small flowers grew close to the water. Their color was clear and delicate, their form simple. He had seen such things before, many times, and yet now he looked at them differently. There was no effort in it. He remained where he was, and the quiet deepened, not as something imposed, but as something allowed. And in that quiet, a single thought came to him, gentle and unforced, as though it had risen from a place itself rather than from within him. It wasn't a thought of sorrow. It wasn't a thought of loss. It was simply a noticing, a recognition of something small and living and quietly beautiful. And though he didn't understand it and would not have named it, it remained. The quiet which had come upon him in the valley didn't leave him at once, though he did not understand how or why it had come. When at last he rose from the moss and stood again upon his feet, it was with a sense that something within him had been loosened, something that had long been held too tightly and had now been gently set free. He drew a long breath without knowing he did so, and even in that simple act, it seemed new to him. "What is it?" he said aloud, though there was no one near to answer. His voice was low, almost uncertain, as though he didn't quite recognize it. "I almost feel as if I were alive." The words passed him quietly, and yet they lingered in the air as though they had a weight of their own. He didn't seek to explain them, nor could he have done so if he tried. There are moments which don't belong to reason, and this was one of them. He remained where he was for a time longer, though he could not have said how long. The stream moved along beside him with soft, continuous sound, and the small flowers at the edge held their delicate color in the clear light. Nothing had changed in the valley, and yet something had changed in him. When at last he turned away and went on his path, the calmness remained with him through the evening. It was not strong or insistent, but it rested quietly, like a memory not fully formed. That night he slept more deeply than he had done for a long while, and there was no disturbance in his rest. Yet he did not know how to keep it. By the next day, the darker thoughts, which had been long familiar to him, returned. Not all at once, but steadily, as though they had only waited for the smallest opening. They came back with their old persistence, filling the spaces which had briefly been cleared. He felt them settle again, and though he didn't resist them, there were moments, brief and uncertain, when they seemed less complete than they had been before. He went on with his wandering. The days passed, and the places he moved through changed with the season. The warm brightness of summer deepened into the richer tones of autumn, and he found himself beside the waters of Lake Como, where the air lay soft upon the hills and the light rested upon the surface of the lake in long, quiet reflections. There was beauty there, as there had been in the valley, and he moved among it without seeking anything in particular. He walked until he was tired, and sat when he chose to rest, and sometimes he found that sleep came more easily to him than it had done before. His dreams no longer carried the same disturbance, and though he didn't question it closely, he was aware of the change. "Perhaps my body is growing stronger," he thought once, though the idea did not settle firmly in his mind. It was not only his body. There were times, unexpected and without clear cause, when the heaviness he carried seemed to lift slightly, as though something within him had shifted and allowed a little more light to enter. These moments didn't remain long, but they came again, and then again, and each time they left behind a faint impression, as though something had begun which would not entirely cease. He began, now and then, to think of Misselthwaite. The thought came quietly, without the sharp resistance it might once have met. He remembered the wide, silent house, the long corridors, the rooms that stood empty. He thought of the place, not with longing, but with a kind of distant awareness, as though it belonged to a life he had set aside, but had not entirely lost. And sometimes, though less often, he thought of his son. He wondered what he would feel if he were to return and see him again. The image came to him as it always had been, a slight figure lying still, a pale face against the pillows, eyes closed beneath dark lashes. He could not hold that thought for long. It caused him discomfort he did not wish to examine, and so he let it pass. Still it returned. One evening, The day had drawn to a close, and the light had faded into the soft and silvered stillness. He walked down to the edge of the lake and found a quiet place where the water lay close to the shore. The air was filled with the faint fragrance of the night, and the world seemed to rest in a deep and gentle calm. He sat there, doing nothing, allowing the stillness to surround him. The water moved softly, touching the edge of the land with a sound that was almost like breathing. The scent of flowers drifted faintly through the air, and the quiet deepened until it seemed to hold him within it. Without knowing when it happened, he fell asleep. It was not a restless sleep, nor one broken by uneasy thoughts. It came to him gently, as though the quiet itself had drawn him into it. And as he slept, he dreamed. The dream was so clear that it did not seem like a dream at all. It seemed instead as though he were awake, sitting where he had been, hearing the same soft sounds and breathing the same scented air. And then, within the stillness, he heard a voice. It was distant, and yet it came to him with a clarity that left no doubt. It was light, and it carried with it a note of happiness, as though it belonged to something that had never been touched by sorrow. "Archie," it called. "Archie!" He rose at once, not startled, but certain. The sound seemed natural to him, as though he had expected it. "Lilius," he answered, "where are you?" "In the garden," the voice replied, soft and bright, as though it were carried on the air itself. "In the garden." The words lingered, and then the dream faded. He didn't wake at once. He slept on, quietly and deeply, held in a rest that did not trouble him. When morning came with a clear and gentle light. A servant stood near, waiting patiently with a small tray of letters. He accepted them without remark, his manner unchanged, though there was a stillness about him that had not been there before. When he was alone again, he sat for a time without opening them. The dream remained with him, not as something he fully understood, but as something that had left a trace. And though he would not yet have said so, and did not know how it had begun, there was within him a quiet sense of something, long, silent, that had begun to stir. He stood for a few quiet moments with the letters still in his hand, his gaze drifting once more toward the lake. The calm which had come to him in the night had not entirely faded, and though it had softened, it remained as something gently present beneath his thoughts. It seemed to lend a lightness to what he considered, as though even his uncertainty no longer held quite the same weight. "In the garden," he said again under his breath. Not with any confusion now, but with a kind of wondering recognition. The words didn't trouble him. They stayed with him instead, as though they belonged to something he had almost remembered. When he turned his attention again to the letters, it was with a quiet mind that he had known for many years. He glanced through them without much interest at first, but one, lying uppermost, caught his notice by its plainness. The hand was unfamiliar, steady but unadorned, and the address bore the mark of Yorkshire. He opened it without expectation. The words within it were simple, and yet they held him at once. He read them through once, then again, more slowly. The name at the close of the letter remained with him, Susan Sowerby. He remembered her, not clearly at first, but as one recalls something honest and grounded. A woman of the moor, a voice without pretense. "I would come home if I was you." He sat the letter resting in his hand, The thought did not strike him with force. It came instead with a quiet certainty, as though it had already taken shape before the words had been written. "I will go back to Misselthwaite," he said. There was no hesitation in it. The decision once spoken seemed only natural. It didn't feel like a turning so much as a continuation. Something already begun, now carried forward. He rose at once and went within, giving his orders simply, without delay. Within a few days, he was on his way back to England. The journey stretched before him in long hours, but they did not pass as they once might have done. The steady motion of the train, the changing landscape beyond the window, the rhythm of the train itself, these seemed to draw his thoughts into a quieter pattern. He found himself thinking of his son. It came to him without effort, without the sharp resistance that had once accompanied it. The image rose as it always had, the slight form, the pale face, the stillness which had seemed so fixed and unchangeable. For years he had turned from it. Now he didn't. The letter lay folded in his pocket. From time to time, without taking it out, he found himself returning to its words, not to question them, but to remain with them. There had been no reproach in them, only a simple urging, offered as though it were the most natural thing in the world. And so, when at last the long journey brought him back across the moor, and the carriage moved along the familiar road, he spoke before he had fully considered it. "Stop at the cottage," he said. The driver drew the horses in without question. The place was, as it had always been, low, weathered, and standing quietly against the wide openness of the land. As he stepped down, the door opened, and the children came out to meet him, their faces curious but unafraid. He asked for their mother. "Oh, she's gone across the moor this morning, sir," one of them answered, making a small, respectful curtsy. "A woman's taken ill with a new baby, and she want help." He listened, taking in the matter simply, without impatience. There was something in their manner, their steadiness, their ease with one another, that held him for a moment. It was not something he had sought, and yet it drew his attention all the same. He looked at them more closely then. They were not finely dressed, nor particularly remarkable in any outward way, and yet there was a kind of health in them, a grounded, natural presence that seemed to belong to the place itself. He reached into his pocket and drew out a coin. He held it for a moment, as though the action itself were unfamiliar to him, and then he placed it in the hand of the nearest child. It was more than they expected. Their eyes widened, not with greed, but with surprise, and then softened into something like quiet delight. They made their thanks simply, without excess, as though gratitude came to them as naturally as breath. He inclined his head slightly, not wishing to make more of a moment than it was. Then he turned and returned to the carriage. As they drove on, the moor opened again before him, wide and unbroken. The house lay ahead, waiting as it had waited for years. He didn't know what he would find there, but the thought no longer carried the same weight. Something had shifted, quietly, steadily, as though he could not yet see the whole of it. He didn't turn away from where it led. He didn't wait. Something had already begun in him before he reached the house, and now it moved him forward without hesitation. When he entered the manor, the servants received him with their usual ceremony, but there was something in his face which made them look at him again. He didn't pass them as he had done before, nor turn away toward the distant rooms where he had hidden himself so long. He went straight to the library. "Send Mrs. Medlock to me," he said. She came quickly, a little breathless, her face flushed with curiosity and unease. "How is Master Colin Medlock?" he asked at once. "Well, sir," she answered, hesitating. He's different, in a manner of speaking." "Worse," he said sharply. Mrs. Medlock flushed deeper. "Well, you see, sir," she replied, "none of us can exactly make him out. He might be better, and he might be worse. His appetite, sir, is past understanding, and his ways—" "Has he become more peculiar?" Mr. Craven asked. "That's it, sir," she said. "Very peculiar. He's used to eating nothing, and then suddenly he began to eat something enormous, and then he stopped again. But if you'll credit it, sir, he insists on being taken out every day. Mrs. Mary and Dickon, Susan Sowerby's boy, they take him, and out of doors he stays from morning till night." "How does he look?" Mr. Craven asked. "If he took his natural food, you'd think he was putting flesh on," she said. "But we're afraid it might be a sort of bloat, and he laughs sometimes, sir, when he's alone with Miss Mary. He never used to laugh at all." There was a brief silence. "Where is he now?" Mr. Craven asked. "In the garden, sir," she answered. "He's always in the garden." "In the garden?" he repeated. He said it again, more quietly. "In the garden." When she had gone, he stood quite still for a moment. Then he turned and went out. He didn't hurry, but there was something drawing him, something he didn't question. He passed through the shrubberies, along the familiar paths he had not walked for years. The fountain was playing, and the autumn flowers burned softly in their beds, but he scarcely saw them. He knew where he was going. Though the ivy hung thick over the wall, though the key lay hidden and buried, he knew. He slowed as he drew near. Then he stopped. There were sounds. At first he didn't understand them. Running feet, light, quick, circling under the trees. Voices, low and breathless, trying not to be heard. And then laughter. Not loud, not careless, but held and breaking through and burst as though it couldn't be contained. He stood very still. "What is it?" he murmured. "What am I hearing?" For a moment he almost believed he was dreaming. Then the sound rose again, clearer now, young, living, unmistakable. And suddenly the door was flung open, the ivy swung back, a boy came running full speed straight through the opening, not seeing him, not knowing, and dashed into his arms. Mr. Craven caught him instinctively, holding him fast to keep him from falling, and then he looked at him. He was a tall boy, straight, strong. His face was glowing with life, his breath quick from running, his eyes bright, gray eyes full of laughter and light. Mr. Craven stared. His hands trembled. "Who?" he said. "Who is it?" The boy stood before him, drawing himself up, his whole being shining with something that had long been hidden. "Father," he said, "I'm Colin." He took a breath, almost laughing, almost unable to speak. "You can't believe it. I can hardly believe it myself. I'm Colin." Mr. Craven did not answer. He couldn't. The past and the present stood right before him together, and for a moment he couldn't separate them. This boy, this strong, living boy, and the child he had left behind. Mary had come through the door, breathless, her eyes wide and watching. And everything had changed. "In the garden, he said hurriedly. "Yes," Colin agreed eagerly. "It was the garden that did it, and Mary and Dickon and the creatures and the magic. No one knows. We kept it to tell you when you came. I'm well. I can beat Mary in a race. I'm going to be an athlete." He spoke like any strong, healthy boy. His face flushed, his words tumbling over each other in excitement, and Mr. Craven felt something within him shake with deep, unbelieving joy. Colin laid his hand on his father's arm. "Aren't you glad, Father?" he said. "Aren't you glad? I'm going to live forever and ever and ever." Mr. Craven held him by both shoulders, steadying him, not because the boy needed it, but because he himself did. For a moment, he couldn't speak. Then at last he said quietly, "Take me to the garden, my boy, and tell me all about it." And so, they led him in. The garden lay before him in its autumn fullness, gold and purple and deep violet blue, with late lilies standing in tall, clustered sheaves, white and white-flushed with ruby. He stopped just inside it. He looked slowly around. "I thought it would be dead," he said. "Mary thought so at first," Colin answered, "but it came alive." They went to the great tree, and there they sat. Though Colin stood because he could not help it, because he wanted to stand as he told everything. And he told it all. The secret, the finding of the key, the robin, the growing things, the long days, and the magic. Mary sat near, watching quietly, and Dickon leaned against the tree, listening as if it were all as natural as the wind moving through the branches. Mr. Craven listened. He listened as though he had never truly listened in his life before. Sometimes he laughed. Sometimes his eyes filled with tears. And sometimes he simply looked at the boy, at his son. When the story had been told, Colin drew himself up. "Now," he said, "it need not be a secret any more. I dare say it will frighten them nearly into fits when they see me, but I am never going to get into that chair again. I shall walk back with you, Father, to the house." Inside the house, Mrs. Medlock stood in the servants' hall speaking to Ben Weatherstaff, who had come in from the gardens. "Did you see either of them, Weatherstaff?" she asked. That I did," said Ben, with a certain satisfaction. "Both of them?" she pressed. "Both of 'em." "Together?" she asked sharply. "Together, ma'am," Ben answered. He lifted his mug and glanced toward the window. "Look there," he said. "If thou's curious, look what's coming across the grass." Mrs. Medlock turned and gave a sharp cry. Other servants rushed to the window, crowding close. And there, across the lawn, came the master of Misselthwaite. And beside him, walking steadily, strongly, his head lifted, his eyes bright with laughter, came Master Colin. And that is how it was seen. That was how it was known. That the boy who had been shut away, the boy who had been feared, had come back into the world, alive and walking. And now, the garden grows quiet once more. Beyond the walls of Misselthwaite Manor, evening settles fully across the wide Yorkshire moor, and the last of the light fades into a gentle, resting dark. Within the garden, all is still. The laughter has passed, the footsteps have come to rest, and what once stirred in secret has now fully opened, without fear. He has come home. The child who was hidden walks in the open air. The father who wandered has returned, and the girl who arrived alone has found her place among them. What was broken has not been hurried. It has been tended, day by day, quietly, until it learned to live again. there's nothing more that the garden needs to prove. It doesn't explain what has happened here. It doesn't measure it. It simply holds it. For this is what it has always done. Through silence, through seasons, through time itself. It has waited. It has grown. It has remembered. And now it rests. The work isn't ended, for nothing living ever truly ends. But something here has been completed. Something has been healed. And that is enough. The house will wake to it. The world will carry it forward. But the garden remains as it always was. Quiet, patient, and alive. For now, the moor lies calm beneath the sky, the earth is still, and the story gently comes to rest. Let the quiet settle around you. Let the stillness carry you into sleep, and allow this story to close, just as it was meant to. You are safe. You are loved. And you have been listening to Nicki Woo Cozy Stories, created by Nicole T. Woodard. May your dreams be gentle, and your sleep be deep.